television show, and he generally taped 2 or 3 shows in one night. And I was the second show, and I said, "Who do you have for the third show?" And he said, "The guest hasn't showed up." So I said, "What do you do?" He said, "I'll just talk." And they turned the camera on, and he just talked for half an hour. On another occasion, he spent an entire half an hour show showing you how to properly eat a watermelon.
That's actually on YouTube. If you just Petey Green watermelon, enjoy.
And he was so good that Dewey Hughes became his manager. He became a stand-up comedian, and he was invited onto the Johnny Carson show, and then got cold feet and got drunk on that day. And Dewey had to appear on the Carson show instead of Petey, but that's another story.
We have
You
some
say, "I'll tell it to the young, I'll tell it to the old, I'll tell it hot, and I'll tell it cold." Petey Green was a character. But I digress.
Well, no, that is yours. There is news. The Washington Post editorial on Evans has just come out, and it says that Jack Evans has abused the public trust, and that the council needs to decide whether he should go or not. But it's very critical of the council and especially Mary Che, for essentially making a decision before they hold the hearings, and that they should have waited and give him his due process.
Which is the same position that Vincent Gray took.
Which Vince Gray took. Mm-hmm. So,
Kojo, when you were talking about Petey, you mentioned Mark Plotkin.
Yes.
And we were talking about him. We were talking about we were waiting for you.
Yes, earlier in the evening. How'd you meet Mark Plotkin?
I used to work with a guy who worked with Mark Plotkin on a presidential campaign, and his name was Bill Christian. He's now also deceased. But he used to talk about working with, and he always referred to him by his last name, Plotkin, and what a character Plotkin was and what Plotkin did. And then finally at the 1988 Democratic Convention in Atlanta, even though I was then working for Howard University Television, that guy was the news director of Howard University Radio, and he wanted to do a daily live analysis from the convention. And he invited Mark Plotkin and me to do that together. And that's how I met him. In later years, I invited him from time to time. We did a weekly news analysis on the television show that I hosted, and he was an occasional guest on the weekly news analysis. We also did, by the way, on the television show, about a monthly program in which we talked with radio talk show hosts about what their listeners were talking to them about, and that's how I got to know Diane Rehm. She used to be a guest on my show at that point. But after that, Plotkin and I got to know each other. We were not friends. And then one day, he called me up and invited me to lunch. And when I got there, he said, "I'm not satisfied with the person who is co-hosting the DC Politics Hour with me. And I'm looking for a replacement for that person. And you popped into my head," and I said, "That's the guy. That's the guy. That's the guy. So will you co-host the show with me?" So I said, "I already have a full-time job. I don't need another one." He said, "Well, you're from the Caribbean. Don't all people from the Caribbean have several jobs?" So, yeah, well, that's true. So I met with the program director at WMU and agreed to co-host the Politics Hour. And then at the end of the meeting, he said, "Well, why don't you try hosting the entire show?" Because the previous host, Derek McGinty, had left for television, and they were using replacement hosts. So I said, "But I have a full-time job, and it's 2 hours a day." He said, "Well, try it for a week." I said, "Well, let me go talk to Diane Rehm about it first, because I know her, and she's been doing this 2 hours a day herself. Let me see what she says." And as soon as I walked into her office, she basically said, "Kojo, you have to do this. You have to do this." And so I agreed to do it for a week. And during that week, I realized how much more I loved radio than television, because radio is such a more intimate medium than television for me. unlike Segraves, there's who left radio to go to television. There's a more intimate connection with you and the listener on radio, and I kind of like that. So I ended up doing it. But anyway, that's how I got to know Mark Plotkin. I digress again. And a professional relationship turned into a very close personal friendship. Mark and I started going to basketball games together, football games together. We started traveling together to go to basketball. We went to Philadelphia. We went to Memphis. We went all over the country going to watch basketball games. And we just hung out a lot together. And from time to time, he found when he got kicked out of Henry Champ's house watching basketball, he would come to my house and watch basketball. And that's how our friendship kind of grew.
I think we missed one part of this. When you were an activist and then suddenly you're doing kids shows on WOL, but when did you decide and what made you decide to switch to journalism and hosting where your opinions you hold back, even on the show now, you hold back your personal opinions, eliciting them from others? How did that occur?
Does anyone know in this room how Howard University got a radio station? Oh, then I'll tell that quickly that story. The Washington Post owned what is now Channel 9, and it also owned two radio stations, WTOP FM and WTOP AM. And at some point, the Federal Communications Commission told the Washington Post that it had to divest itself from one of those broadcast properties that it owned because it had become too dominant in this marketplace. That restriction no longer exists. So the Washington Post decided to sell its FM station because in those days, nobody listened to FM. So in 1971, the Washington Post decided to sell its FM station to Howard University for $1. It was in fact a gift. However, it happened to coincide with a time where long playing records were becoming more popular and where the FM format and the FM sound lent itself to playing long playing records and music. And so when Howard University Radio came on the air, it started playing the long playing format. And within a decade, that format began to dominate radio and FM became the dominant force. Well, in 1973, Drum and Spear Bookstore had closed. I was out of work. Howard University Radio had advertised for a news editor, and since I had edited the radio program at WL, I applied for the position as news editor. At that point, there were like 3 reporters at the station. One of them was Milton Coleman, who later became an editor at the Washington Post. I applied for the job as news editor, and you're right about one thing. Up until that point, I was both an activist and was used to be able to give my opinion in broadcast. However, once I got the job at Howard University Radio as news editor, I learned very quickly that I had to leave my opinions at the door and to take a different approach to journalism, and that's the approach that I've had ever since then.
How hard is that having a radio show every day and keeping your opinion to yourself, particularly in light of the times we are in today?
It's very difficult, but I'm privileged to have, and I've always been privileged to have, a group of producers, a few of whom are sitting here this
While
evening.
we were waiting for you, I introduced them there. So one of the many things we did while we were waiting.
So you now know who really does all the work.
And this
But-
is some of them. How many
Yes,
do you
yes.
have? You have like 6 or 7, don't you?
Yes, but a few of them are part-time, and a couple of them are graduate students who are interns. So we have a great staff, but they are able to find people with opinions, some of whom reflect my own opinions. I won't say which ones, but they're able to find people with opinions, and I have the pleasure and the privilege of being able to extract from those people what their opinions are. And I discovered that I enjoyed doing that. At one point, when I was working at Howard University Radio, I was the news director, and I fell out of favor with the general manager because I turned out to be a witness for an employee he had fired, and as a result, I was demoted, and I created a show called Insight, which still airs on WHUR Radio, a 20-minute talk show, and that's how I got into being a talk show host, and I discovered that I liked that, I think, even more than I liked reporting.
I just would remind people, we have cards out there. If you have questions, you can jot them down. If you write with really big print legibly, then I can read them. I'll ask them.
Do you need to put your glasses on?
No, that's all right, because
I can read them.
I can read. Why don't you read this
Why
question,
why
Tom?
doesn't he wear his glasses? Is it
I
vanity?
don't know.
Is
It's
it
I don't look
vanity?
good with the glasses.
Why
on.
don't
It's
you?
all vanity.
It's vanity.
You don't
I
have to
thought
worry
it
about
was.
that on radio.
Thank you.
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
So one of our guests would like to know, they say, Kojo, your style of questioning on the radio is fairly pithy. Tom's isn't. Do you ever wish Tom would follow your example?
Absolutely not. One of the things that made me want to do the DC Politics Hour on WAMU was because Mark Plotkin had so much institutional knowledge and was so opinionated and was such a personality. When we recruited Tom after Mark Plotkin, after luring me into the position, then he deserted me and left and went to WTOP. And then Janetta Rose Barris did our analyst for a little while. And then we were looking for another analyst, and Tom had been a guest analyst from time to time. And Tom had that same kind of institutional knowledge, plus he brought his own quirky personality to the airwaves, a quirky personality that everybody who had ever worked with him or interacted with him knows about, but something the viewers on NBC4 may not have been aware of. But once he was able to be our resident analyst, then he was able to expand, so to speak, from what he was doing at NBC4. People got to understand just how knowledgeable he is, just how quirky he is, just how pesky he can be.
I have a good sense of humor too.
Questioning guests, and that yes, he also does have a good sense of humor, and
Modest.
And
honesty doesn't count.
It works because personality really works in radio, and he happens to have one.
Also from the audience, is there someone that you would like to interview you have not been able to get? Is there someone you've been trying to get, a dream interview, or?
Right now, it's Jack Evans. We've been working.
I invited him to come on the show Friday, even though I couldn't do it in the producers. But if you were going to make an announcement, if you weren't making an announcement, we didn't want him.
And we've been trying to get Jack Evans on for several months now. And there used to be a time when we couldn't get Jack Evans off the show. He would come and he would not want to leave. We'd have to almost literally push him out the door.
Even as the other guest was coming in trying to sit down, Jack would not get up.
Exactly. Now we can't get him on the show. So he's the guest that we want. In terms of a dream guest, my dream guest was Nnamdi Azikiwe. And he visited Washington when he was 95 years old. And I was hosting the television show at Howard University. And we booked him as a guest on the show. And on that day, he fell ill and could not do the show and had to be flown on an emergency basis back to Nigeria, where he died shortly afterwards. So that's been the biggest disappointment of my life, that I never got to interview this man after whom I named myself. But yeah.
How do you and your producers, just kind of a rough idea of how you get together? You've got to book a whole show, an hour a day at noon. We know what the politics hour, the events of the week, but you've got 4 days. You used to do Tech Tuesdays when you had 2 hours a day. But how do you scope out the show? Is it just what you're interested in? How do you have meetings and discuss it endlessly, or how do you get that done?
The words meetings and endlessly are the key words to understand what goes on. We have a lot of meetings. we meet at least twice, sometimes 3 times a day. And we meet first thing in the morning to go over exactly what our plans are for that day and to get ideas about future shows. We meet immediately after the show to assess how the show went, whether or not the producers messed up or whether or not I messed up. Um, and again, to figure out what we could have done better. And again, what other ideas do people have? Because events may have occurred during that morning that we didn't have a chance to discuss. Because every single day we want to make sure that we try to be on top of the news. So if anything happened, we have these several meetings to try to figure out exactly what we're going to do the next day or the next week or the next 2 weeks. And every Tuesday, we have a much longer meeting that is our planning meeting. So we always try to make sure that we're planning 2 or 3 weeks in advance um, about what shows we're going to do. And then there are a gazillion little meetings that take place during the course of the day with the managing producer and other producers, with the managing producer and me, with producers and other producers. And it's just we meet all day long.
So can I ask you how much ratings, demographic, and geography play into your decision-making process as to what topics, what guests to have?
One of the biggest differences I found when I left commercial broadcasting and came to public broadcasting is that outside of the managers, the individuals who work in public broadcasting are not as ratings conscious as people who work in commercial radio. We are ratings conscious, but it's not something we discuss every day. In commercial radio, it's something you discuss every single day. What do the numbers say today? We are interested in whether or not people are not only watching the show, but the manner in which people are listening to the show, whether they're listening to our podcast, whether they're listening to us live, whether they're tweeting, whether they're on Facebook. We try to explore all of those avenues. But um, ratings never decide, or ratings are never the major factor in whether we decide to do a topic. The major factor is what we assess as the importance of that topic and what is the likely appeal of that topic to our listening audience. Um, we all know the kind of demographic that the public radio audience had. So the thing we struggle with most of all is sports, because our listening audience is a part of a demographic that is not exactly crazy about sports, but is interested in the social issues related to sports. So whenever we do sports, we try to make sure that there's a social or political issue related to sports, and we rarely ever do just sports, unless of course we happen to be winning the World Series or happen to be winning the WNBA. Then we'll do sports just for sports, because then the whole town gets interested in it.
Do you say the Washington football team's name?
Yes, I do, because it is the team's name. I notice that you tend to say Skins most of the time, and you don't say the name, but I think sometimes you say the name too, don't you?
I try to do, I'd say it once about every fifth or eighth time.
Yep, just about the
Because
same.
it
What
would
do
be
you?
nice if Dan Snyder would sell the team and the new owner would change the name.
I
Can you get
think
Dan Snyder on your program?
no.
That would be a
I
political
think we have
question.
asked in the past, but we have not been able to get him on the program.
You know Diane Rehm. Do you know Joshua Johnson, who does 1A, which precedes you?
Yes, I do know Joshua Johnson, and when they were auditioning people for that show, they auditioned like 10 trillion gazillion people, and they were on every day. And the last one to audition was Joshua Johnson, and you could hear the groundswell around the station on the day when he was doing his show. It was essentially the same thing Plotkin said about me. That's the guy. That's the guy. Everybody said, that's the person who should replace Diane Rehm. It was like unanimous. Everybody felt that it should be Joshua Johnson. And so he did. And um, I don't get a chance to see him a lot because when his or listen to him a lot because when his show is on is when I'm preparing for my show, so I have to listen to his podcast or listen to the replay that comes on at night. And we don't get a lot of chances to socialize except when the station has events. But yes, I do know and like Joshua Johnson.
Mark asked about ratings, but JJ Yor, the general manager for WAMU, will tell you that TOP and AMU bounce back and forth as who's number one or who's number two.
And
It was
during
TOP, when he was at TOP, they were number one most of the time. Is that right, Mark?
All the time.
Oh.
usually
I would
during,
crush Kojo's show.
during the political season is when we tend to beat out WTOP when like their elections in Virginia or their national elections, then we tend to get more listeners than TOP. But for the past several years, the number one and number two stations in the city have been unchangeable. It's either been WTOP or WAMU, and everyone else is a distant
HUR
third.
gets up there and TOP is fading, but I think TOP would want me to ask you about pledge drives. And do they annoy you as much as they annoy some people, I'm told?
No, they don't. Because as I tell people all the time, I have a future in panhandling because I have learned how to beg. And the television station that I worked with before coming to WMU was also a public television station. So we had pledge drives there also. And what the station does and what we do is we get pumped for the pledge drive. We psych ourselves up to believe that this is the first time we're doing this. It's never been done before. It's the first time. And it's going to be really, really exciting. And the listeners are going to really, really love it this time. But we all know what really happens.
Do you get you can contribute online, and a lot of people do now. Do you have any sense of the call-in? There used to be, to me, there were more people downstairs filling that room with answering the phone like a hothouse selling cheap stocks, but they're not there as much anymore. Is it mainly, are they somewhere else in the building? I never go upstairs. I don't know, but is it mostly online?
Yes, there are at other locations, but we now have every year the number of online contributions we get is increasing, and it's more and more online than it is by people actually calling up on the telephone. If you do actually make a contribution by telephone and we have your phone number, you should know, and this is another, I'll give you an inside scoop here. We have something called a thankathon, which takes place after the pledge drive. Has anybody in this room ever been called as a result of our thankathon? I have called quite a few people. We all take shifts calling people up and thanking them for participating.
It's not
in the
a
pledge
recorded
drives.
thank you. It's live.
No, it's live.
Oh
You
my
call
God.
people up and.
So how much would I have to donate to get Kojo to record my outgoing voicemail message?
It varies from pledge drive to pledge drive. In your case, it'll probably take a few $1,000s.
Should we make a show of hands of the audience of who's contributed to WAMU, or would you rather not know?
No, let's shame the people who have not contributed. All of those who have not contributed can raise your hand.
We have another question from the audience. They want to know about your relationship with Marshall Brown.
Marshall Brown?
Kwame's father?
I can guess
Kwame.
where the question came from.
Well, Marshall Brown.
We should say, give an idea who he is.
Marshall Brown is
Well, I'll
former
tell you.
Council Chairman Kwame Brown's father and a longtime political
Barry
operator.
Ivanhoe, crowd guy.
I think I met Marshall Brown before I even started in radio. I think I met Marshall Brown around 1971 or 1972. He was associated with Pride Incorporated, an organization founded by Marion Barry and his then wife, Mary Treadwell, that was a community-based organization that did a lot of things, but one of the things it did was help young people find jobs, train young people for jobs. And Marshall Brown worked for that organization. When I met him, he was a Marion Barry loyalist. And when Marion Barry first ran for mayor, Marshall Brown was his advance guy. He was one of his organizers. And as Tom will tell you, Marshall was a hustler. He was always moving very fast. And like I said, he was an old friend. And one day, back in the early 2000s, he invited me to lunch and he said, "Oh, by the way, I have sons who are about the same age as Marshall Brown's sons. So our sons knew one another growing up. And one day he invited me to lunch at the Islander Caribbean restaurant on U Street. And Kwame was there and he said, "We've decided to run Kwame for office." And Marshall was a brilliant campaigner, really knew how to organize a campaign. And that's how Kwame Brown first became an at-large member of the DC Council and later chairman of the city council. And then a few years ago, maybe about 5 years ago, Marshall Brown passed. He had cancer and he passed. But that's who Marshall Brown was. But he was a terrific organizer. He was such a good advance man that Marion Barry recommended him to Jesse Jackson when Jesse Jackson was running for president. And Marshall was Jesse Jackson's advance man every place, even in Cuba. And he spoke no Spanish. He was Jesse Jackson's advance man because he was that good.
You mentioned your sons, the fraternal sons. Is that right? They're
Fraternal twins. I have a total of 5 sons, 2 of whom are fraternal twins. And my eldest son is now 50. My fraternal twins are 48. I have a 33-year-old and a 27-year-old.
and one of them is a researcher, scientist, or somebody has some kind of fancy job that makes you look paltry.
He's a neuroscientist who teaches and runs a lab at UCLA. Yes.
Any other questions from the crowd?
No.
What do you think of Mark Segraves?
I try not to think of Mark Segraves. No.
Has he ever been on your show? He told a story about it. You told the story about it.
Coach,
I
I
met Mark Segraves through Plotkin, right?
Well, you thought you did, yes.
I thought I met Mark Segraves through Mark
I lied
Plotkin
about that.
when they both worked at WTOP together. And Mark Segraves is a very good reporter, but what moved me most is that when Mark Plotkin, who, as we mentioned yesterday, was given the bouts of depression, I experienced 2 of them, and when they occurred, they lasted for about a year. And
you personally experienced, or Mark's?
No, I personally experienced Mark Plotkin's depression because he spent way too much time at my house when he was depressed. But when he was depressed, this guy, Mark Segraves, went to lunch with him every single day for that entire year. And that was a Herculean task for which I commend you highly, but it just shows the kind of empathy that Mark Segraves is capable of having.
Tom.
Can we cut part of that?
And for that show of empathy, Plotkin stopped speaking to him.
For 6 years.
6 years.
One of those years we shared an office.
I will say that I recommended you for Channel 4 because you were younger, faster, and cheaper.
And then, like Plotkin did to me, he abandoned you there.
Yes, exactly.
No,
Coach, well, you have a question?
No,
I know you do a lot. How many graduations do you get asked to do, and how many do you do? And is there just one standard Kojo graduation speech we get, or what's your message to graduates?
I used to do a lot of high school graduations in Washington, D.C. In the past few years, I've only done a couple of college graduations, thank goodness. The graduation speech is a grind because you have to speak for about 20 or 25 minutes, and you want to say something original that these young people have not heard before, and that's very, very hard to do. You want to say something inspirational, but invariably the inspirational thing you say is likely to be extremely boring. And so you want to tell some stories that young people will find interesting. And it's difficult. You try to inject as much humor as you can into the graduation speeches because the kids are really not there to hear you. They're there to collect their diplomas, and they're there to throw their hats into the air, and they're there to party afterwards. So it's a chore. And as the years have gone by, I have turned down speech making requests more and more. I'd much rather MC a program. I'd much rather participate in a panel discussion because Writing that graduation speech can take 7 or 8 hours to do, and it's hard. It's hard to write. But I don't have a standard graduation speech. I have seen speakers, usually politicians, who have standard graduation speeches that they can just roll out. I've never been able to roll out a standard speech. Wherever I have to speak, for some reason or the other, I want to give an original speech, something I haven't said before.
You do like to do something called Kojo in your community, and you do get around the metropolitan area there. Um, how do those come about? Do you decide who you want to talk to and what, and then the producers bring it together? Is that one of your endless meetings?
Yes.
Um,
And as a matter of fact,
it's another one coming up.
they're always coming up. During the course of my 20th year, we changed the name from Kojo in Your Community to the Kojo Roadshow. And Margaret Barthel, our producer, was brought on to help with the Kojo Roadshow. It started out, interestingly enough, back in the early 2000s as WAMU in Your Ward. We had restricted it to the District of Columbia, and we wanted to have them in every ward of the city. And as it became increasingly apparent that our listenership was not concentrated in the District of Columbia, but was also spread in Maryland and Virginia, we expanded it and changed the name to Kojo in Your Community, and ultimately the Kojo Roadshow. I think our producers enjoy those a lot. It gives us the opportunity to interact with our listeners in ways that we normally would not interact with them. It takes us out into communities where we actually get to meet people. And it serves the purpose of having communities realize just how much they share with other communities in this region, a region that we often tend to think of that is separated by geography, by class, by race, by all kinds of other phenomena. But that roadshow allows us to have people in the so-called DMV realize that we share something all together besides the nationals and the football teams and the basketball teams, that we tend to share
Traffic.
metro and traffic and all of those things together.
Well, I started this program by saying where you were born 75 years ago in Ghana. You're going to be 75 in January. I think it's January the 8th, if I remember correctly.
Correct.
What is the future of the show? What are you thinking about as you look ahead? You've got an incredible presidential campaign that's already driving us crazy now. It's going to be even more so next year. Lots of things are going on in Virginia with the change of the parties. Significant, the Kerwin Commission fight over education in Maryland. There's a hell of a lot going on. Where do you see yourself in this continuum next year or two? Any thoughts about that you would say?
Well, I love what I do. And even though I have reached what a lot of people consider to be the age of retirement, my affection for what I do and the service we perform has not waned over time. I work by contract, and I have a contract that expires sometime late next year. And so the station and I are talking about what I'm going to do after that. The station has expressed an interest in me staying on. And I frankly have no specific retirement plans or any specific retirement objectives. I'm a lot like you. I want to kind of retire and still do what I like doing a lot. And once I can continue to do it, I think I will continue to do it. There was a time when I thought that I'd retire and get a home on a beach someplace and write great novels, but that pipe dream, the only thing left is the pipe. And so that's not a dream that I'm pursuing at this point. So we'll just have to see what happens.
I did an interview yesterday with Colby King of the Washington Post, who was 80 in September.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that he has been thinking about stopping so he can write a book about the change in the metropolitan Washington area that he saw for the last 30 years. But he says every Monday when he sits down to write I don't want to tell the city paper story, but he says he sits down on Monday to think about what he's going to write. He writes it on Wednesday. He turns it in on Thursday. And he says, I keep thinking this is the last one, but it never is.
It never is, because you get the urge to do it again the next Monday. And that's the urge I think I get. I just get up every day wanting to do this show. And so my wife says, when are you going to retire? My wife has been retired for 5 years, even though she's much younger than I am. And she really, really enjoys it. She loves gardening. She likes her life. She likes being able to organize her own life. People like you and me who've been doing this for so long, we have these clocks in our heads that motivates us every single day to do what it is we've been doing and what we like doing. So we'll see how long I can continue to do that. You are theoretically retired from television, but I check your Twitter feed every day, and you're up working from the time you get up in the morning.
I didn't retire. I refocused.
Oh, yeah.
But there's too much going on to retire. We're about out of time. Do we have any last questions from the audience? Anybody want to make a last minute question? Kojo came late, so we worked a little bit later than we normally do for this show.
It's
Yes.
not work.
Can you just... The future of national public radio.
From everything that I have seen, in large measure, because of at least two phenomena. One is because of the political climate in the country, and because of the disappearance of long form reporting. One of the biggest regrets that I think all of us has is seeing how our newspapers are disappearing around the country, and as a result, long form reporting is disappearing. We look at the news on television, it's generally fairly short, except for Segraves' contributions. And we look at what's going on in much of talk radio that is so partisan at this point.
Cable TV, the same.
Cable
Worse.
TV, the same. And so people have fewer and fewer sources for long form reporting and in-depth discussion to turn to. And increasingly, National Public Radio is where people turn in order to do that. So in spite of this deteriorating media environment, I think National Public Radio has a very bright future.
I forgot to ask you about jogging. I was told by a friend of yours that you jog, and I said I'd never seen any evidence of it.
No, I jogged for 45 years, and then my knees and my back said enough. And so I now, like you, ride a bicycle 2 or 3 times a week. And that works for me. I always used to say I didn't really enjoy jogging. I always enjoyed having jogged. But I actually enjoy riding while I'm doing it.
Yes.
So it's much better.
Cycling is good if we can just get more cycle tracks, Tara. All right, ready? That's it. Kojo Nnamdi, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, wait, did you have final words? Do you have some kind of, small C summary? You just did it.
No.